Good evening, everyone. I'm Dr. Basil Constantine. I'm here from the ACU Online Writing Center, and today we're going to go ahead and have a conversation of sorts about the logic behind some APA style rules. Now, this is part of a series where we explore different ways of structuring information, of organizing it, with the goal of understanding how to write and communicate more clearly in a particular style system. So we're going to look at three questions today submitted by students, and then, time permitting, take a few more. So let's go ahead and get started with our first advanced questions. So the first question is, what is corporate authorship and how does it affect citations? So let's take the first part of that. What is corporate authorship? So that's when some sort of organization, rather than an individual person where we have a name attached, where the organization claims credit. And this is something that we'll see often in a example where the website or a page on a website or some printed material does not have a specific author named, but we still have the thing and we know it was produced by an organization. And so the organization claims the corporate authorship. So let's take a look at a example here. So we're going to go to look at the McDonald's website here. It is a well-known corporation. And if we were to say, go ahead and look at this page here about our food here. Well, if we look at this, we have this section here. We can click through to different things. Let's just randomly pick the food experts article here. And our concern is not so much the information on a particular page, but on there being some content that we're interested in. So if you were writing in your paper to say, oh yes, on the McDonald's website, there is a food experts page, and then you have a citation to that, the question comes up, well, who would you attribute as the author? Now, in some cases, you would list in quotation marks the title of the page, but this isn't the case where we don't know at all who created it. We have the organization. You can see at the bottom here, copyright 2017 to 2023, McDonald's. And this isn't just for for-profit corporations either. This is something that comes up with other organizations as well, very commonly with government entities. So let's go ahead and we'll also look at an example from the National Institutes of Health. And if I could have a suggestion for a topic that we might find on the National Institutes of Health website. Okay, we have ADHD. Okay, great. So let's take a look at some resources here. Now, if you look at this page here, we see up at the top left-hand corner, it says National Institute of Mental Health. Down at the bottom, we have National Institute of Mental Health. So that is a subdivision within the National Institutes of Health. And if we look here, we have the NIH logo up here and then National Institute of Mental Health because it's one of the National Institutes of Health, so a subset of NIH. So if we look at this page here, we see that this page itself, none of this is signed. And because it's not, the entity that owns this or that runs this page, the National Institute of Mental Health, would be cited as the author. Now, there are some cases where it gets a little bit more complicated and where perhaps you might want to look at the APA manual for this. So that's great. Well, we can go ahead and look at that. So the APA manual in this case is the publication manual of the American Psychological Association 7th edition, which is a little bit of a mouthful, but it's a very handy resource when you're looking for something specific, when you want to see a example of a rule or a particular case. And so you can see in this example here at the bottom, we have number 40. Okay, so that's a cooperative thing between two different governments, which is why we have Australian Government Productivity Commission and New Zealand Productivity Commission. Okay, but what if it's something that is not between governments? What if it's something that is from an entity of itself? And this next example is a great example. So at the top of the page, you can see National Cancer Institute. Now, the National Cancer Institute is an entity within the National Institutes of Health, which is itself part of the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. And so what we have here is the most specific entity is listed as the corporate author. That's National Cancer Institute here. Let me go ahead and point that out a little more visibly. So National Cancer Institute, that is the most specific author. So that goes in that area. And then we have the parent organizations here, because National Institutes of Health, that's one level up from National Cancer Institute. And then U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, that is the entity for which the National Institutes of Health are part of. So as you can see, we can go ahead and say, all right, we're going to have all three of those in the reference, but we're going to have the most specific one, National Cancer Institute, that will be our author in the author date part of the citation. And if we look at some of these other examples here, you'll see that this is distinct from, for example, number 52, where you have individual authors, and that's the Blackwell and so forth. This is a case where you have individuals who are working and publishing through the CDC, but it's a team of individually named authors. So we would just have Blackwell et al. As the authors for citation purposes. But also in the example at the bottom, you can see British Cardiovascular Society Working Group. That's a sub-entity within the British Cardiovascular Society. So that's why you have British Cardiovascular Society Working Group listed as the author, and then the publisher is British Cardiovascular Society. So again, you want the most specific thing to be listed as the corporate author. All right, so if we return to our question, and what is corporate authorship and how does it affect citations? When a named set of authors is not present, but something is produced under the imprint of an organization, whether a government entity or a corporation or other thing, that entity claims the corporate authorship. And so when you are citing with author and date information, that specific corporate authorship will be named. If it's part of a larger entity, like the National Institute of Mental Health is part of the National Institutes of Health, then that more specific one, National Institute of Mental Health, would be listed as the author in our citations. Excellent question. Our second question is, where and why does APA 7th edition encourage using first-person perspective? Now, we'll say here we have first a question of, what do we mean by first person? And we can shorten that to say using I and me and my, mine. This is when you're referring to you, the person writing this, as doing something. Now, it is a myth that APA style doesn't allow the use of first-person perspective. It is, however, true to say that in earlier editions of APA style, for example, APA 5th edition, you did not normally use first-person perspective. And the problem there is that when identifying something that you did or you own, like, oh, I am someone who is XYZ, to explain your action or positionality or the influences, this led to a lot of confusion because you would have these passages that would say, this person who looks a lot like me, who's done things that I've done, but I won't actually tell you is me, did that. And so to avoid that confusion, APA style now, and has for the last 15 years, now encourages the use of first person perspective when it clarifies who did what. You don't need to use it all the time. So for example, in a paragraph, if you start saying, I conducted all the research, then you can use more indirect phrasing like, the participants were interviewed, which is fine because we know from that first sentence, I did the work. So APA 7th edition again encourages the use of first-person perspective to clarify who did what, because it's usually the most clear and concise and direct way of stating that. And conciseness is a virtue in APA style. Excellent question. Third one, what does APA style say about recent scholarship? Now, this is what I think is a leading question, a question that leads us to consider something else. But let's stay first with, what does APA style say? APA style doesn't actually give a specific threshold for that. And I believe they actually explore this in their APA style blog, which let me go ahead and bring up to show you in case you're not familiar with it. So the APA style blog is created by the editors of the APA manual, the people who authored it, put it together, updated it. And you can see that they have a variety of posts. And if we continue down here and select load more, we'll find that we have, oh, hey, no first person myth. If we go back a little bit, we'll find that we have here we are, the outdated sources myth. And you can see in the preview here, the outdated sources myth is that sources must have been published recently, such as the last 5 to 10 years. There's no timeliness requirement in APA style. Now, they go into that a little bit more, but let's talk about the question that that preliminary question was leading to, or rather, what the question, the underlying question is, that once you know what APA style says, we see, okay, well, where did that question come from? What motivated it? And this is probably coming because many journals and faculty committees who are supervising something like a capstone, a doctoral project, a dissertation, will specify that you need to use recent scholarship. And that's founded in the general idea that your research should be relevant and based on information that is still relevant. Now, the truth is that what is still relevant will depend a lot on what you're doing. If we were, say, talking about the COVID-19 pandemic, most of your scholarship about that would be coming out from 2020 to present, because that's when the awareness of the pandemic really kicked off. Maybe you have a couple things from 2019, but if you're talking about the pandemic itself, you're kind of limited to the period, at least starting when it happened, which would be December 2019, the first reports. Now, if we are talking about, say, grounding your discussion in different frameworks, there are plenty of frameworks and models and such that were developed in the 60s, the 70s, the 80s that are still in use today. And so while that might not be the most current set of ideas in terms of newness, if we look at currency as still being used, still relevant, still helpful or informative, absolutely. So what you'll usually get is something like the 80% rule. The 80% rule is a rule of thumb that says work to make sure your sources are reasonably current, and that if we were to count, we'd want, at least 80% of the sources to be from a certain period of time, of which people generally will agree, last 5 years, sure, that makes a lot of sense. We can agree that that counts as research. Now, if you're talking about, say, conditions in your study site, you might want something that is as current as possible. If the most current published thing is 10 years ago, well, point that out in your lit review, but that's the most current published thing there is. But in general, try and keep things current. Try and keep things recent. And if there's not, give a discussion so it's clear why you're using that. If your literature review includes a text like this, the most recent thing available is XYZ, then we know that. If you just cite that source and you don't explain why, we don't necessarily understand why you're using something that's older. And this is often something that motivates someone's research, saying, hey, there's not enough recent research on this. We are addressing that gap. We're addressing this gap to let something else happen. So to recap, APA style doesn't specify that you must have sources with a specific timeliness. That said, your arguments will be stronger if they are grounded in things that are clearly relevant and clearly still relevant to whatever you are using them for. If I was writing a paper about, say, classics history, let's say I'm talking about the works of Josephus, who wrote about, Roman and Jewish society in the early century, the first century AD. As a primary source, we don't have a ton of primary sources for that time. It's a very valuable one to use. If you were going to be writing about that topic, there has been a lot of other literature in the field that is more recent that you might want to use. Is that necessarily going to have come out in the last 5 years? No. It depends a lot on what you're doing. I have a friend who wrote what I believe is still the definitive dissertation about a particular aspect of Jewish society around the time of Jesus. And except for the book that she published on that same topic, it is the most recent and in-depth thing on that. Is that going to be within that window? No, because she finished that more than 5 years ago. But is it the most relevant still? If you're doing that specific thing, yes. And so it will make absolute sense to cite it and draw on that. That concludes our brief discussion about some of the underlying rationales and motivations in APA style. We encourage students to write in with questions, because if it's something you're asking, chances are someone else wants to hear it too. So on that note, if you have any questions, feel free to send us an email at onlinewritingcenter@acu.edu, to go to my.acu.edu to schedule an appointment, or visit the Online Writing Center website and find these recordings and more. Have a good night.